A woman sits at her mirror in 14th century Paris. She's holding a pair of tweezers, not to shape her eyebrows, to eliminate them entirely. Strand by strand, she's plucking away her hairline, pushing it back 2, 3, sometimes 4 inches. Blood beads along her forehead where the follicles tear. Her eyes water, but she doesn't stop. Because in her world, a high forehead isn't just beautiful, it's essential. It's the difference between being desirable and being invisible. And this is just the beginning. Tonight we're diving into the twisted, toxic, genuinely insane world of medieval beauty standards. Not the romanticized version, not the sanitized fairy tale. The real practices that women and men endured to be considered attractive. The poisons they swallowed, the bones they broke, the flesh they scarred, the years they shaved off their lives, all in pursuit of an ideal that changed with the seasons and killed without mercy. Before we start, if this kind of deep dive into history's darkest vanities is your thing, take a second to subscribe. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and whether you're here to relax or just morbidly curious about how far humans will go to be beautiful. Because what we're about to uncover, it makes modern beauty standards look merciful by comparison. So settle in, dim the lights, get comfortable, because we're about to spend the next 2 hours examining every twisted, brutal, absolutely deranged thing people did to their bodies in the name of beauty. And by the end, you'll understand why vanity has always been humanity's most expensive religion. Let's begin with something that sounds innocent, harmless even, forehead plucking, but what it actually involved? That's where the horror starts. Picture this. It's 1375. You're a noble woman in London. You wake up, look in your polished metal mirror. Glass mirrors are rare, expensive, the image always slightly distorted. And you see your hairline, natural, normal, framing your face the way hair has framed human faces since the beginning of time. And you're disgusted. Because in medieval Europe, from roughly the 13th century through the 15th, a high forehead wasn't just fashionable, it was the beauty standard. The singular most important feature a woman could have. Forget clear skin, forget symmetrical features, forget bright eyes or full lips. If your hairline was low, if your forehead was normal-sized, you were considered almost bestial, peasant-like, unattractive in a fundamental, unfixable way. The ideal forehead was massive, elongated, stretching from your eyebrows almost to the crown of your head. Think of those portraits you've seen. Medieval women with foreheads that look 3 times too large. That wasn't artistic exaggeration. That was the goal. That's what they were actively trying to achieve. Why? Why did this become the standard? Best guess? It started with noble women who wore elaborate headdresses. Hennins, those tall cone-shaped hats, became popular in the 1400s among French and Burgundian nobility. To wear them properly, you needed to pull your hair back severely, and the higher your forehead appeared, the more elegant the overall silhouette became. But it went deeper than fashion. A high forehead was associated with intelligence, with refinement, with the Virgin Mary herself, who was always depicted with a prominent, exposed forehead in religious art. If you wanted to signal virtue, piety, nobility, you needed that expanse of pale skin stretching toward heaven. So women started plucking, and plucking, and plucking every single day, sometimes multiple times a day, using tweezers made of bronze or iron or even wood, primitive tools that grabbed hair but also tore skin. That created infections, that left scars. Start at your natural hairline, pluck every hair along the front, then move back a 1/4 inch, pluck again, another 1/4 inch, again. You're trying to create a hairline that's 2 to 4 inches higher than where nature put it. You're essentially trying to go bald by choice, but only in the front. The pain was constant. Pulling hair from the root triggers your nerve endings every single time. Your forehead swells, goes red and inflamed, bleeds in spots where you've pulled too aggressively or where infection has set in. And you can't just do this once. Hair grows back. So every few days, you have to pluck it all again. Maintenance that never ends. A lifetime of self-inflicted pain just to maintain a forehead that society has decided is beautiful. But here's where it gets worse. Some women weren't satisfied with just plucking. They wanted permanent results, so they turned to caustic substances. Quicklime mixed with arsenic. Vinegar combined with cat dung. Yes, actual cat feces, aged and fermented. These mixtures were applied to the hairline like a paste, left on until the skin burned, until the hair follicles were chemically destroyed. The process was agonizing. The chemicals ate through skin, created open wounds that wept and oozed, often became infected because medieval hygiene was, to put it mildly, not great. Women would develop fevers. The infections would spread. Some died from sepsis that started as a beauty treatment, and their eyebrows? Gone. Completely removed. Because the fashion wasn't just a high forehead, it was a smooth, uninterrupted expanse of skin from your eyebrows to your hairline. No brows to break up the space, no hair at all. So women plucked their eyebrows entirely, every single hair, or they used the same caustic mixtures, burning away the hair and often the skin around their eyes, creating scarring, damaging their vision in some cases when the chemicals dripped or were applied too liberally. Imagine looking in that polished metal mirror and seeing your reflection. No eyebrows, a forehead that stretches impossibly high, skin that's red and scarred and covered in scabs from your daily plucking routine, and thinking, yes, this is beautiful. This is what I need to be. But wait, because there's more. Some women didn't stop at the hairline and eyebrows. They plucked their temples too, the sides of their foreheads, creating an even more exaggerated shape, an almost alien appearance where hair only existed at the very back and top of the head. We have written accounts from the period, moralists, usually men religious figures, railing against this practice, saying women were defacing God's creation, that they were vain and sinful and destroying the natural beauty they'd been given. But the women didn't stop, because the alternative was worse, being considered ugly, being passed over for marriage, being socially invisible. In a world where a woman's entire future depended on making an advantageous marriage, beauty wasn't optional, it was survival. And if the price of survival was daily torture, well, that's what tweezers were for. One account from 1420 describes a young woman whose forehead plucking became so aggressive, so obsessive, that she developed a chronic infection across her entire hairline. The skin turned black with necrosis. She eventually died, probably from sepsis. She was 19 years old. Her family blamed vanity, said she'd brought it on herself. Her obsession with beauty had killed her. They weren't entirely wrong, but they also weren't asking the right question. Why was she willing to die for a high forehead? Because her world told her that without it, she was worthless. That's not vanity, that's desperation. And it wasn't just women. Men participated too, though less extremely. Noble men would pluck their hairlines slightly, not as aggressively as women, but enough to give them that refined intellectual look. Because a high forehead signalled intelligence across genders. Brutish, low foreheads were for peasants and labourers, for people who worked with their hands instead of their minds. This standard persisted for centuries, shifted slightly depending on region and decade, but the core remained. High foreheads, no eyebrows, smooth pale skin stretched tight. It only started to fade in the late 1500s when fashions changed and hair began to be worn differently, when ruffs and different head coverings made the elongated forehead less necessary for overall aesthetic balance. But by then, generations of women had spent their entire lives in pain, had scarred themselves permanently, had damaged their skin beyond repair, all for a beauty standard that would eventually be abandoned as casually as it had been adopted. The foreheads were just the beginning, because medieval beauty standards didn't stop at your hairline. They wanted to control every inch of your body, starting with your face and working down. Let's talk about eyebrows, or rather, the absence of them. But here's the twist, the exception. The one place where everything reversed, Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire. While Western Europe was busy plucking themselves bald, Byzantine culture was doing the exact opposite. In Byzantine beauty standards, from roughly the 5th century through the fall of Constantinople in 1453, a unibrow wasn't just acceptable. It was the ideal, the most desirable feature a woman could have. A thick, dark unibrow that stretched across the bridge of your nose in one continuous line. That was peak beauty. That was what men wanted, what women aspired to. We see it in their art, Byzantine mosaics, icons, frescoes, women depicted with prominent, unbroken eyebrows, dark and heavy and utterly unapologetic. Why? What made this culture value the exact opposite of what Western Europe prized? Classical influence. Byzantine culture saw itself as the continuation of ancient Greece and Rome. And in classical art, full eyebrows were associated with wisdom, strength, passion. The great beauties of mythology, Helen of Troy, Aphrodite, were often described as having strong, dark brows. Byzantine women took this and ran with it. If your eyebrows didn't naturally meet in the middle, you filled them in, used charcoal or soot mixed with oil, drew that line across your nose bridge, made yourself match the ideal. But even better, if they didn't grow dark enough naturally, you could encourage them. There were recipes, mixtures that supposedly promoted eyebrow growth and darkening. One Byzantine beauty manual from the 10th century recommends grinding up flies, actual dead flies, and mixing them with oil. Apply this paste to your eyebrows nightly. The text claims it will darken the hair and promote growth. Did it work? Probably not. Did it cause infections and skin irritation? Absolutely. Another recipe calls for ashes mixed with myrrh and various oils. Apply it warm. Leave it on overnight. Your eyebrows will supposedly grow thicker, darker, more luxurious, and if you couldn't grow a natural unibrow, if your genetics just didn't support it, you faked it every single day, using whatever pigments you had available, creating that single line that marked you as beautiful according to your culture's standards. The irony is delicious. Western European women are burning off their eyebrows with caustic chemicals, while Byzantine women, 1,000 miles away, are trying desperately to grow them darker and fuller. Same time period, same species, completely opposite beauty standards, and both groups willing to poison themselves to achieve their respective ideals. This is the thing about beauty standards. They're not universal, they're not innate, they're completely arbitrary, culturally constructed, and yet people will die for them, will torture themselves, will spend their entire lives pursuing something that's only beautiful because their particular culture says so. But the Byzantine unibrow obsession points to something deeper, something about how beauty standards connect to cultural identity, to resistance against foreign influence, as Western European fashion started to spread through trade and cultural exchange. Some Byzantine women began adopting those trends, plucking their brows, separating them, creating that Western European look, and Byzantine moralists lost their minds, wrote treatises about how women were betraying their culture, abandoning their heritage, becoming corrupted by foreign influences. The unibrow became nationalist, a political statement. Maintaining your unibrow meant you were a true Byzantine, a real Roman, because they still called themselves Romans. Plucking your brows meant you were contaminated by barbaric Western tastes. So women's faces became battlegrounds, cultural identity written in hair and pigment. Your eyebrows announced which civilization you belonged to, and women, caught in the middle, had to choose. Conform to their own culture's standards, or adopt foreign beauty ideals that might offer different opportunities. This tension persisted right up until the fall of Constantinople, when the Ottomans conquered the city In 1453, they brought their own beauty standards, and the Byzantine unibrow, it faded into history. But for nearly 1,000 years, it was the defining feature of Eastern Mediterranean beauty, the thing that separated civilized women from barbarians, all because of eyebrow hair. Now, let's talk about body size, because medieval beauty standards about weight were complicated, contradictory, and absolutely punishing, regardless of which direction you were trying to go. Here's what you need to understand about medieval attitudes toward the body. The flesh was suspect, sinful, a source of temptation that needed to be controlled, disciplined, subjugated to the spirit. This belief permeated everything, and it created a beauty standard that's hard for modern minds to comprehend fully. The starvation aesthetic, the idea that true beauty, spiritual beauty, the only kind that really mattered, came from denying the body, from making yourself as insubstantial as possible. Thin was holy. Thin meant you were winning the war against your own flesh. Thin meant devotion to God over worldly pleasures. This hit women particularly hard, because women's bodies were seen as more carnal, more tied to the physical world through menstruation and childbirth. Women needed to prove their spirituality harder, needed to transcend their bodies more completely. So they starved. This wasn't about fashion in the way we think of it now. This was religious devotion, manifesting as an eating disorder. Sanctioned, encouraged, celebrated. We have saints whose entire claim to holiness was their refusal to eat. Catherine of Siena, 14th century. She began fasting as a young girl, started with giving up meat, then reduced her meals to bread and water, then just water, then barely anything at all. By her 20s, Catherine was subsisting on the Eucharist and occasional herbs. She would force herself to vomit if anyone made her eat. She described her fasting as spiritual warfare, battling her body's desires, proving her love of God through denial of physical needs. She was considered incredibly holy, divinely inspired. Young women across Europe heard about her and tried to emulate her. Starvation became a path to sainthood. Catherine of Siena died at age 33, her body destroyed by malnutrition. She likely died from stroke or organ failure brought on by severe anorexia. The church canonized her, made her a saint, held her up as an example of perfect devotion. She wasn't alone. There's a whole category of medieval female saints called anorexia mirabilis, miraculous lack of appetite. The miracle was that they survived as long as they did without eating, that they could function at all while starving themselves to death. Clare of Assisi, Margaret of Cortona, Angela of Foligno, Beatrice of Ornacieux. The list goes on. All of them fasted to extremes. All of them praised for it. All of them held up as examples of how women could achieve holiness. And regular women, not seeking sainthood, absorbed this message. Beauty wasn't about robust health. It was about spiritual refinement, about looking ethereal, otherworldly, like you barely existed in the physical realm. Being thin, not just slender, but visibly wasted, became fashionable among noble women, a sign that you were refined enough to care more about your soul than your stomach, that you had the discipline to deny your body's demands. Women would fast regularly, not for health, not even entirely for religious reasons, though that was the justification, but because the aesthetic was aspirational. Hollow cheeks, visible collarbones, wrists so thin they looked like they might snap. This is described in literature from the period. Courtly romances where the most beautiful women are described as pale and delicate and fragile, almost transparent, like they might dissolve into mist. The language is revealing. Women are described as ethereal, delicate as flowers, light as air. These aren't metaphors, they're literal descriptions of women who are starving themselves. And the men writing these descriptions, they found it attractive, found something appealing about women who looked like they might not survive the winter, But here's where it gets complicated, because at the same time, there was a counter-narrative, a different beauty standard that existed simultaneously. For women who were married, women who needed to produce heirs, women whose value was tied to their ability to have children and survive childbirth. For them, being too thin was dangerous, undesirable. Those women needed curves, needed enough body fat to menstruate regularly, to carry pregnancies, to nurse babies. For them, the starvation aesthetic was a threat to their primary function. So medieval women were caught in an impossible bind. Before marriage, be thin, be spiritual, be ethereal, prove your virtue through visible denial of physical needs. After marriage, suddenly gain weight, become fertile, demonstrate your ability to bear children through your body's robustness. The same woman was expected to have two completely different body types at different life stages, and to transition between them on command. This is insane, physiologically punishing. Your body doesn't work that way. You can't just decide to gain or lose significant weight instantly because your life circumstances changed. But women tried, had to try, because the alternative was being considered defective, failing at your role, becoming socially worthless. Young women fasted to dangerous extremes, then got married and were expected to immediately start eating enough to become pregnant. Their bodies, already damaged from years of malnutrition, struggled. Menstruation might have stopped entirely from the starvation. Fertility was compromised. Pregnancies were higher risk. We have medical texts from the period describing how to help young brides gain weight after marriage, recipes for rich foods, advice about rest and reduced physical activity, instructions for basically trying to repair the damage that years of fashionable starvation had done. And if you couldn't get pregnant, if your body, wrecked from years of not eating, refused to conceive, that was your fault. You were barren, cursed, failed woman. The connection between the previous starvation and the current infertility was rarely made, or if it was acknowledged, it was blamed on the woman's lack of discipline in a different direction. She'd been too vain in her youth. Now God was punishing her. There was no winning, but the starvation aesthetic persisted because it served multiple purposes. It kept women's bodies controlled. It channeled normal human hunger into spiritual devotion. It made women's suffering into virtue, and it created a physical ideal that was almost impossible to maintain, which meant women were always failing, always needing to do more, deny more, suffer more. The church loved this, male authorities loved this, a population of women who were literally weakening themselves, making themselves ill, all in pursuit of an ideal that kept them controllable. Perfect. This standard didn't really fade until the Renaissance, when classical ideals came back into fashion and a bit more fullness became acceptable. But even then the tension remained. The Virgin Mary versus Venus, spiritual emaciation versus fertile curves. Medieval women were stuck navigating between these poles, damned if they were too thin, damned if they weren't thin enough, their bodies constantly judged, constantly wrong. And all of this suffering and contradiction and impossible expectation was considered normal, just what women did to be beautiful. Now, let's talk about teeth, because medieval dental aesthetics were absolutely deranged. Sugar arrived in Europe through trade routes from the Middle East around the 11th century. Initially, it was rare, expensive, only the wealthiest. Nobles could afford it, which made it a luxury item, a status symbol, something that announced your position in society, and consuming sugar regularly had a very visible effect. It rotted your teeth, turned them brown and black, created cavities that destroyed your smile. In any rational world, this would be considered hideous, a sign of poor health and bad hygiene. Medieval Europe? Not rational. Black teeth became fashionable because black teeth meant you could afford sugar, meant you were wealthy enough to consume it regularly, meant you were nobility. Wait, it gets worse. Poor people, people whose teeth were naturally white and healthy because they couldn't afford sugar, started artificially blackening their teeth, trying to fake the status marker, trying to look like they had access to luxury goods they couldn't actually afford. Women would use various substances to darken their teeth, soot mixed with honey, charcoal ground into paste. In some regions, they deliberately create cavities using acid. There are accounts of women rubbing their teeth with vinegar to erode the enamel, to create that darkened, damaged look that signaled wealth. Because white teeth, those were for peasants, for people who'd never tasted sugar, for the lower classes. This was most pronounced in England, where sugar became particularly fashionable in the later Middle Ages. Elizabeth I, yes, we're jumping slightly ahead chronologically, but this is too perfect not to mention, was famous for her blackened teeth. They were rotted from her sugar consumption, and rather than seeing this as a problem, people saw it as a sign of her refinement, her royalty. Ambassadors would comment on her black teeth in their reports, not as criticism, as observation, noting that the Queen obviously had access to the finest luxuries. But here's the thing about rotten teeth: they hurt, constantly. Medieval dentistry was primitive, brutal. There was no effective pain management, no way to treat cavities beyond pulling the entire tooth. So people, noble people, wealthy people who could afford sugar, walked around in constant dental agony. Abscesses formed, infections spread, sometimes to the brain. People died from tooth infections that started as status symbols, and still, black teeth remained desirable, because they announced your wealth, your access to rare goods, your position in the social hierarchy. The contradiction is staggering. Beauty standard that causes visible pain and health problems, but it's pursued anyway, because the alternative, looking like a poor person, is worse. This is vanity in its purest form. Suffering deliberately chosen because the social benefits outweigh the physical cost. But sugar wasn't the only way to damage your teeth for fashion. There were cosmetics, substances applied to teeth to whiten them, or sweeten breath, or create particular effects. And almost all of them were toxic. Medieval women wanted red lips. This part, at least, hasn't changed. Red lips have been considered attractive across most cultures and time periods. Something about the colour signals health, fertility, youth. But medieval women didn't have access to modern lip products. No petroleum jelly base, no FDA regulations, no safety testing. What they had were minerals, plant extracts, and a shocking willingness to put literal poison on their mouths. The most common lip colour came from vermilion, cinnabar, mercury sulfide, the same substance that was used in paints and dyes and, if you remember our previous discussion about Elizabeth I, in the red powder that covered her corpse. Mercury sulfide is toxic. Ingested in sufficient quantities, it causes mercury poisoning. Tremors, cognitive decline, kidney damage, psychosis, death, and women were putting it on their lips multiple times daily, licking their lips, ingesting small amounts constantly. The effects were cumulative. You wouldn't drop dead from one application, but years of daily use. Your body would accumulate mercury, store it in your organs, your brain. Women would start experiencing symptoms, tremors in their hands, memory problems, mood swings, but they wouldn't connect these symptoms to their cosmetics. Why would they? Everyone used these products. This was just normal life. The lip colour was created by grinding the cinnabar into fine powder and mixing it with oils or fats, sometimes animal fat, sometimes plant-based oils. The result was a red paste that could be applied to lips. It looked beautiful, bright, vivid red, exactly the desired colour. It also tasted terrible, metallic and bitter. But beauty requires sacrifice, right? You learn to ignore the taste, reapply throughout the day as it wears off from eating and drinking. Apply extra before social events to ensure your lips stay vibrant. And slowly, steadily, you're poisoning yourself. Alternative lip colours were available: crushed berries, strawberries, cherries, mulberries. These were safer, non-toxic, but they were also less stable. They didn't last as long, didn't provide as intense a colour, and they were harder to produce in quantity. So most women who could afford it stuck with the Mercury-based vermilion, because it worked better, looked better, lasted longer. Never mind the trembling hands, the foggy thinking, the strange dreams, the gradual loss of coordination. Those were just part of getting older, surely. Nothing to do with the pretty red paste you put on your lips every morning. But wait, there's more, because lips weren't the only facial feature women coloured. Cheeks needed to be rosy, flushed, like you'd just come in from a brisk walk or were healthily modest and easily embarrassed. Natural blush wasn't always achievable, especially not if you were following the starvation aesthetic and your body was too weak to send proper blood flow to your extremities. So women used rouge. And guess what rouge was often made from? If you guessed more mercury compounds, you'd be right. Sometimes mixed with lead, both highly toxic, both absorbed through skin. Apply it to your cheeks, blend it in, create that healthy glow that your actual health can't provide because you're malnourished and poisoned. The irony is painful. Using toxic substances to create the appearance of health, while those same substances destroy your actual health. There were plant-based alternatives. Alkanet root created a red dye. Madder root. Various flowers crushed and mixed with fats. These were safer but, again, less effective, less vibrant, required more maintenance, so the toxic versions persisted because they worked better, because beauty standards demanded that level of colour, because appearing healthy was more important than being healthy. And the worst part? This was common knowledge. It wasn't secret. Medical texts from the period warn about the dangers of cosmetics containing mercury and lead. Moralists railed against women's vanity, pointing out that these substances were literally killing them. Women knew, and used them anyway, because the social consequences of not being beautiful were worse than the physical consequences of poisoning yourself. This is the calculation. This is the choice. Slow death through toxic cosmetics versus social death through being considered ugly. And for medieval women, social death was often literal death. No marriage meant no security. No children meant no purpose. Ugliness meant abandonment. So they chose the poison. Knowingly, deliberately, every single day. Let's move on. Because we need to talk about hair, specifically the absolutely insane things women did with their hair in pursuit of beauty. By the 1400s, hairstyles had become architectural, literal construction projects that women built on their heads. Using their own hair, false hair, wire frameworks, an absolute commitment to suffering. The styles varied by region and decade, but the principle remained the same. Bigger was better. More elaborate was more beautiful. Your hair needed to defy gravity and common sense in equal measure. Let's start with the hennin, that cone-shaped hat you see in medieval paintings. Tall, pointed, often with a veil flowing from the peak. The hennin itself was just wire and stiffened fabric. But to wear it properly, you needed to arrange your hair in a very specific way. Pull it back tightly, smooth it down, sometimes plaster it to your head with egg whites or tree sap to keep it absolutely flat. This created tension on your scalp. Constant pulling. Traction alopecia was common, permanent hair loss from the sustained stress on hair follicles. But the hennin was almost modest compared to what came later. Hair towers, elaborate constructions that could reach 2 feet high, made from the woman's own hair combined with false hair, shaped over wire frames, decorated with jewels and ribbons and sometimes even small ornaments. Creating these styles required hours, sometimes an entire day. You'd need servants or family members to help. You couldn't do this alone. First, wash your hair. This happened infrequently, maybe once a month if you were diligent. Less often if you were following certain beauty advice that claimed washing too often damaged hair. Then, while it was still damp, begin the construction. Separate your hair into sections. Some portions would be braided and wrapped around wire forms. Other sections would be coiled and pinned. If you didn't have enough hair, and most women didn't for the more elaborate styles, you'd add false hair. This could be hair from other people, or animal hair, usually horsehair, sometimes human hair, collected from hairbrushes and saved over months. The wire frames provided structure. Think of them as scaffolding. You'd attach your hair to them, winding and pinning and securing with wooden or metal pins. Some women used tiny nails. Layer by layer, the structure grew, rising higher, taking shape, your neck straining from the weight, your scalp aching from the pins and the pulling. Once the basic architecture was complete, decoration, ribbons woven through, jewels pinned in, pearls strung along the wires, maybe small ornaments, birds made of precious metals, flowers crafted from silk. If you were truly wealthy, you might add gold thread, or even small bells that would tinkle when you moved your head. The final step was setting, using various substances to keep everything in place. Egg whites were common. Brush them over the hair and let them dry, creating a kind of natural hairspray. Tree resins, beeswax, whatever would hold the structure together. The result was spectacular, a tower of hair and ornament and craftsmanship rising from your head, announcing your wealth, your status, your dedication to fashion. It was also incredibly heavy. These constructions could weigh 5 to 10 pounds. Imagine carrying that on your head. The strain on your neck, the pressure on your spine, the headaches that must have been constant. And you couldn't just wear this for a few hours. Once you'd invested the time and effort to create the style, you wore it for days, sometimes weeks. Oh, you slept with it, tried not to disturb it, used a special pillow, sometimes a wooden block, to keep the structure intact while you dozed, sleeping with your head on a wooden block, neck at an uncomfortable angle, unable to move freely because any significant movement might damage the hair tower you'd spent 8 hours building. Your scalp itched constantly. Couldn't scratch properly because you'd disturbed the pins and wires. The hair closest to your head, pressed flat and plastered down, would become greasy and start to smell. But you couldn't wash it without destroying the entire structure and starting over. Days passed. The construction remained, growing increasingly uncomfortable, increasingly unhygienic, but still beautiful, still fashionable, still worth every moment of suffering, because this is what beauty required. And lice, oh the lice. Medieval Europe had a serious lice problem anyway. Everyone had them. But these elaborate hairstyles, lice paradise, warm, dark spaces between layers of hair and wire, impossible to properly clean or check. Women would have lice crawling through their hair towers, breeding in the warm spaces, biting their scalps, and there was nothing to be done short of taking down the entire structure and starting over. Some women just accepted it, lived with the itching, the discomfort, because the alternative was admitting defeat, giving up on fashion. There are accounts of women whose hair towers became so infested that when they finally took them down, hundreds of lice and nits would fall out. Their scalps would be inflamed, sometimes bleeding from the bites, and then they'd wash their hair, rest for a day or two, and start building the next elaborate structure. This madness persisted for decades. Hairstyles grew more elaborate, more extreme. Competition between noble women about who could create the tallest, most ornate construction. The church, predictably, hated it. Preachers railed against these towers of vanity, called them sinful displays of pride, said women were trying to reach heaven through pride rather than through humility, and God would strike them down. Some regions even passed sumptuary laws trying to regulate hair height, maximum measurements for how tall a hairstyle could be. These laws were largely ignored because fashion doesn't obey legislation, and women weren't building hair towers to please the church or follow laws. They were doing it to compete with each other, to signal their status, to demonstrate their wealth and their commitment to beauty standards. The fashion finally began to fade in the late 1500s, when styles became somewhat simpler. But by then, Generations of women had strained their necks, damaged their scalp, and spent countless hours in pain. All so their hair could reach toward heaven, even if their souls allegedly couldn't. Now we need to talk about one of the most bizarre beauty practices of the medieval period. Something so strange it sounds like satire, but was absolutely, seriously real. Pregnancy padding. This is going to sound insane, because it is insane. But in certain regions and time periods, women who weren't pregnant would pad their stomachs to make themselves appear pregnant. Why? Why would anyone do this? Because pregnancy meant fertility. Fertility meant value. A visibly pregnant woman had proven she could conceive and carry a child. In a world where a woman's primary value was reproductive, pregnancy was the ultimate status symbol. So unmarried women, or recently married women who hadn't conceived yet, would sometimes fake it, stuff their gowns with padding to create the appearance of a pregnant belly, go out in public looking visibly with child, announce their fertility to the world, even if it was complete fabrication. This wasn't universal. It wasn't happening everywhere, all the time. But we have enough documentation to know it was a real practice in parts of medieval Europe, particularly in certain Italian city-states and regions of France. The padding would be shaped, not just random fabric shoved under a dress. These were crafted forms, shaped to look like a pregnant belly at various stages. You could purchase them from merchants or make your own, following patterns that circulated among women. The idea was that by appearing pregnant, you'd signal your desirability to potential husbands, or if you were already married but hadn't conceived yet, you'd reduce the social pressure and speculation. Look, I'm fertile, everything's fine, no need to wonder if I'm barren. Sometimes, women would gradually increase the size of the padding over weeks or months, mimicking the progression of pregnancy, creating an entire narrative, and then suddenly the pregnancy would end. They'd claim miscarriage or stillbirth. Tragic, but these things happened. No one could really question it. This served another purpose too. If a woman was actually pregnant from an illicit affair, she could claim the pregnancy had been ongoing longer than it actually had. The false padding early on gave her cover. When the real pregnancy showed, she'd just switch from false belly to real one, and no one would know the timeline had been manipulated. But here's where this gets truly dark. Some women, particularly young unmarried women, were forced into this by their families. If a marriage had been arranged and the groom's family was concerned about the bride's fertility, the bride's family might have her wear pregnancy padding during courtship, to ease concerns, to make the match more appealing. The padding under her gown, the carefully crafted lie. And if she was discovered after marriage to not actually be pregnant, well, that was a problem for after the marriage contract was signed and the dowry exchanged. This deception could backfire spectacularly. Imagine being a groom who married a woman partly because she appeared fertile, only to discover after the wedding that the pregnancy was fake. The annulment proceedings, the accusations of fraud, the social scandal. But women were desperate, and families were desperate. In a world where a daughter's only value was her ability to marry well and produce heirs, any edge helped. Even if that edge was literal padding tied around your stomach under your gowns. The padding itself was uncomfortable. It was hot, extra layers in an era before air conditioning, during summers that could be brutal. It shifted as you moved, requiring constant adjustment. You had to be careful how you sat, how you walked, making sure the padding looked natural and didn't slip out of place. And you had to maintain the fiction constantly. Couldn't admit the truth to friends or servants because gossip spread. One person knowing meant everyone knowing. You had to act the part, adopt the posture of pregnant women, move more carefully, rest more often, maintain the performance every waking moment. The psychological toll must have been immense, living a lie, fearing discovery, knowing that if you were caught, your reputation would be destroyed. You'd be considered a liar, a fraud, unmarriageable, but the alternative, being unable to prove your fertility, being passed over for marriage, Becoming a burden on your family, that was worse. So women stuffed padding under their gowns and prayed no one looked too closely. This practice declined as medical understanding improved and pregnancy could be verified through other means. But for a time, it was just another tool in the arsenal of feminine survival strategies. Another lie told in service of beauty standards and social expectations, from fake pregnancies to real foot deformity. Because we need to discuss shoes, medieval shoes, specifically the kind that could barely be called shoes at all. Picture a shoe. Now make the toe longer. Longer. Keep going. 2 feet long. 3 feet. Now curve it upward at the tip like a scorpion's tail. Sometimes attach it with a chain to your knee so you don't trip over your own foot. Congratulations. You've just imagined pollenas, also called Krakows, and they were absolutely real. These shoes appeared in the 14th century and remained fashionable through the 1500s. The defining feature was the elongated toe, not just slightly pointed, absurdly, comically, dangerously long. The length of the toe indicated your status. Commoners might have toes that extended a few inches beyond their actual foot. Still annoying but manageable. But nobles, aristocrats, their shoes could have toes that extended 2 or 3 feet, creating footwear that was basically unwalkable. That was the point. If you could afford shoes that made walking difficult, it meant you didn't need to walk. You had servants, you had carriages, you had the luxury of impracticality. These shoes were crafted carefully. The extended toe was usually stuffed with wool or moss to maintain its shape. Sometimes they had wire frameworks inside to keep the curl at the tip. The whole construction was sewn into the shoe, creating one solid piece. Putting them on required help. You couldn't easily slip into pollenas by yourself, especially not the longer versions. Someone had to assist, hold the shoe, help guide your foot into it, adjust the fit. And walking? Walking was an art form. You had to lift your feet higher than normal to prevent the toe from catching on the ground. Your gait changed, became slower, more deliberate, more obviously aristocratic because you physically couldn't move like a peasant who needed to actually get places efficiently. Stairs were a nightmare. You had to approach them sideways, carefully navigate each step. One wrong move and you'd trip over your own footwear, potentially falling down an entire flight of stairs. Dancing became a choreographed exercise in not stabbing your partner with your shoe. The long toes had to be managed carefully, positioned to avoid collision. The chains that some versions had, yes, chains attached from the toe to your leg, helped control the shoe's movements somewhat, but also added weight and restriction. Your feet, crammed into these shoes, suffered. The toes were compressed, pushed together, forced into positions that weren't natural. Over time, this caused deformities, bunions, hammer toes, joint problems that persisted even after you stopped wearing the shoes. And you couldn't really run, couldn't react quickly to danger. If there was a fire or an attack or any emergency requiring rapid movement, you were handicapped by your own footwear. Several historical accounts mention nobles being caught and killed during conflicts because they couldn't flee effectively. Their shoes prevented escape. Fashion became a death sentence. The church again hated these shoes, called them obscene. Some preachers claimed the curled toes were phallic symbols, that wearing them was a form of sexual display, that they were tools of the devil. Some regions banned them outright, passed laws limiting shoe toe length. In some places, only nobles above a certain rank could wear shoes with toes longer than a specified length. Sumptuary laws that turned footwear into legal enforcement. But people loved them. Nobles competed over who could wear the longest, most elaborate pollenas, who could walk most gracefully despite the impediment, whose shoes were most expensively decorated with jewels and embroidery. For women, the fashion was similar but often slightly less extreme. Female pollenas tended to have shorter toes, maybe 6 inches to a foot rather than 2 or 3 feet. Still impractical, still uncomfortable, still a status symbol that announced you didn't need functional footwear. But some noble women went all in, wore shoes as extreme as the men's, hobbled themselves in the name of fashion, made walking an ordeal just to prove they could afford shoes that made walking nearly impossible. The fashion finally faded in the early 1500s when styles changed and different impractical footwear came into fashion. But for nearly 2 centuries, European nobility walked around on literal clown shoes, risked injury and death, deformed their feet, all because elongated toes meant you were important. Let's take a brief pause here because we need to talk about something that affected both the cosmetics and the daily life of medieval people. Something that's almost impossible for modern people to comprehend fully: the smell, or rather, the desperate attempts to cover the smell. Medieval Europe smelled bad, objectively, horrifically bad. There's no polite way to put this. People didn't bathe regularly. There was no running water, no modern sewage systems. Waste, human and animal, filled the streets. Leather tanning used urine and feces. Butchers worked in open-air markets. Everything rotted in the heat. And people smelled like all of this, like sweat and waste and decay, because they were living in it, breathing it, wearing it on their clothes and in their hair. But nobility wanted to distinguish themselves, wanted to signal that they were different from peasants. So they used perfumes, heavily, constantly, attempting to create a bubble of pleasant scent around themselves that would separate them from the general stench of medieval life. These perfumes were strong, not subtle. They had to be strong to cover the underlying odours, and they were often dangerous, made from substances that were either toxic or became toxic through the methods used to concentrate them. Musk was popular. Actual musk taken from the glands of musk deer or civet cats. This required killing the animals, harvesting the glandular secretions, and processing them into perfume. The scent is animalic, musky obviously, overwhelming in concentration. Ambergris was another luxury perfume component. This is basically whale vomit, formed in the digestive system of sperm whales and expelled or harvested from dead whales. It has a sweet, earthy scent when processed properly, and it was worth more than gold. But most people couldn't afford musk or ambergris, so they used more accessible ingredients: flowers steeped in oils, herbs crushed and mixed with fats, spices ground into powder and stuffed into sachets, and heavy metals. Because everything in the medieval period had to involve poison somehow. Lead acetate was used to sweeten perfumes. It has a sweet taste and can mask unpleasant odours. It's also toxic, causes lead poisoning, but it was cheap and effective, so perfumers used it liberally. Mercury compounds appeared in perfumes. Supposedly, they had antibacterial properties. In reality, they just added more poison to the mix. These perfumes were applied directly to skin. Liberally? You weren't just dabbing a bit behind your ears. You were coating yourself, trying to create a barrier of scent between you and the world. Some nobles had perfumes applied to their clothes, their bedding, their furniture, trying to perfume their entire environment. Servants would walk through rooms swinging censers, like in churches, filling the air with heavy, sweet smoke. The effect was overwhelming. Accounts from ambassadors and travellers describe the stench of aristocratic courts as being almost as bad as the city streets, just in a different direction. Instead of the smell of waste, you had the cloying, heavy smell of too much perfume, mixed with the underlying odour of unwashed bodies and clothes that couldn't really be cleaned effectively. The psychological impact of this was significant. Your sense of smell, constantly assaulted, never able to smell something neutral or fresh, always either unpleasant body odour or overpowering perfume. No middle ground, and the perfumes themselves were making people sick. The heavy metals were absorbed through skin. The strong scents caused headaches and nausea. Some people developed allergies or sensitivities, breaking out in rashes, experiencing breathing difficulties. But no one could admit the perfume was the problem, because not wearing perfume meant smelling like everyone else, meant being common, meant failure to distinguish yourself. So people marinated in toxic perfume, coated themselves daily, breathed in concentrated scents that damaged their respiratory systems, all to avoid smelling like the reality of medieval life. There was also a sexual element to perfume use. Strong scents were considered arousing, stimulating. Perfume was advertised as making you more attractive, more desirable, more likely to secure a good marriage or extramarital affair. Women would perfume their bodies before meeting with lovers or potential husbands. Concentrate the scent on pulse points, wrists, neck, behind ears, places where body heat would activate the perfume and spread it. Some recipes specifically promise to make you irresistible, to drive men wild with desire. These usually involved animal musks, those animalic scents that supposedly triggered primal instincts. Did it work? Probably not in the way they hoped. But the placebo effect is powerful. If you believed the perfume made you attractive, you might carry yourself with more confidence. And confidence is attractive. The perfume trade was huge business. Merchants travelled established routes bringing exotic ingredients from the Middle East and Asia. Fortunes were made and lost based on perfume fashions. Entire cities became known for their perfume production. And through it all, people were poisoning themselves, slowly accumulating heavy metals, damaging their sense of smell. The constant exposure to strong scents can actually damage olfactory receptors over time, experiencing allergic reactions and respiratory problems. But they kept using perfume because the alternative, smelling like a human being who lived in medieval conditions, was socially unacceptable. We need to talk about eyes now, about the literally blinding lengths women went to for beauty. Belladonna, beautiful lady, that's what the name means in Italian, and it refers to a practice that was as vain as it was dangerous. Belladonna is a plant, Atropa belladonna, also called deadly nightshade. It's highly toxic. The berries, the leaves, the roots, everything about this plant can kill you. It contains tropane alkaloids that affect your nervous system, your heart, your ability to regulate your body temperature. But it also has one very specific effect. When extract from belladonna is dropped into your eyes, it dilates your pupils, makes them huge, dark, prominent. And in medieval and Renaissance Europe, dilated pupils were considered beautiful. They made your eyes look larger, darker, more mysterious. They gave you that wide-eyed, innocent look that was fashionable. So women, particularly in Italy, where this practice was most common, would drop belladonna extract into their eyes before social events. The process was simple. Extract juice from the plant's berries or leaves, dilute it slightly with water or rose water, then use a small dropper, or even your finger, to place drops directly onto your eyeball. The effect was immediate. Your pupils would dilate within minutes, stay dilated for hours. Your eyes would look stunning. Large, luminous, exactly the desired effect. But belladonna doesn't just dilate your pupils, it paralyzes the muscles that control pupil size, which means your pupils can't contract normally, can't adjust to different light levels. So for the hours that the drug was active, you were effectively light sensitive. Bright light was painful, overwhelming. You had to stay in dimly lit rooms, avoid going outside during the day, squint constantly if you were forced into bright environments. Your vision would also be blurry. Belladonna affects your ability to focus. Things up close became difficult to see clearly. Reading was nearly impossible. Navigating stairs required extra care. And the headaches. The intense throbbing headaches from your pupils being stuck in one position. From your eyes struggling to process light levels they couldn't adjust to. All of this for a few hours of having beautiful eyes at a social event. But the danger was more than just temporary discomfort. Because belladonna is poison, and even applied topically to your eyes, it's absorbed into your bloodstream. Small doses cause the pupil dilation and blurred vision. But even slightly too much, your heart rate increases. You feel flushed, overheated. Your mouth goes dry. You might experience confusion, hallucinations, difficulty coordinating your movements, larger doses, seizures, respiratory failure, death. And there was no standardization, no quality control. Each woman was essentially making her own preparation from plants she grew or purchased from an herbalist. The concentration of the active compounds varied wildly, depending on the plant, the preparation method, how long ago it was made. 1 drop might be perfectly safe. 2 drops from the same batch might kill you. Women died from belladona poisoning, not frequently enough to stop the practice, but regularly enough that everyone knew it was possible. The risk was accepted. The price of beauty. And even if you didn't die, repeated use caused long-term damage. Your eyes would become sensitive. Your vision could be permanently affected. The constant dilation and paralysis of your pupil muscles could cause lasting problems with light sensitivity and focus. But women used it anyway, because dilated pupils were beautiful, because men supposedly found it attractive. Something about dilated pupils triggering instinctive attraction, because that's what happens when someone is aroused or interested. Whether that's actually true or just rationalization for a harmful practice is debatable. But the belief was there, and that belief drove women to poison themselves repeatedly for aesthetic purposes. The practice was most common in Italy, but it spread to other parts of Europe. France adopted it, Spain, England. Anywhere that Italian fashion influenced local beauty standards, belladonna use followed. The church condemned it, called it vanity and temptation, said women were using devil's herbs to seduce men. Preachers railed against it from pulpits, warned that God would strike down vain women who mutilated their bodies with poison. Medical texts warned about it too. Physicians wrote about the dangers, documented cases of women dying or going blind from overuse, advised against the practice. Women largely ignored both the church and the doctors, because social pressure was stronger than fear of divine retribution or medical consequences, because looking beautiful at tonight's banquet was more important than the possibility of dying next week. This continued well into the 1700s, only began to fade when fashions changed and dilated pupils were no longer considered the height of beauty. But for centuries, women were regularly dripping poison into their eyes, blinding themselves temporarily, risking permanent damage, sometimes dying, all for eyes that looked slightly larger for a few hours. Now we're going to discuss something that combined multiple forms of torture into one garment. The pinnacle of medieval body modification, the mechanical corset. We've already touched on corsets earlier when discussing Elizabeth I and her deformed ribcage, but we need to go deeper, need to understand the full scope of what these garments did and why women, and sometimes men, submitted to them. Early medieval corsets were relatively simple. Fabric reinforced with wood or bone, laced tight to create a smooth silhouette. Uncomfortable, but manageable. But by the late medieval period and into the Renaissance, corsets evolved, became more sophisticated, more constrictive, more mechanical. The goal was to create a very specific shape, not just slim, not just smooth, but structurally altered, changing the body's natural proportions into something considered more aesthetically pleasing. For women, this meant tiny waist, flat front, pushed up breasts. The corset compressed the waist while forcing the bust upward and the stomach flat. Completely artificial proportions that couldn't exist without external force. These corsets used metal, steel stays and channels that created rigid structure, boning made from whalebone or metal that didn't bend. These weren't garments, they were devices, machines designed to reshape flesh. Putting one on required assistance. You couldn't lace yourself into these corsets alone. You needed someone to pull the laces, tighten them incrementally, apply force that you couldn't generate yourself. The lacing would start at the bottom, pull tight, then the middle, then the top, The person doing the lacing would often brace themselves against the wearer's back, using their body weight and leg strength to pull the laces tighter. The process took time. 15 minutes, 20. The corset gradually closing around your torso like a vice, each pull of the lace reducing your waist another fraction of an inch. Your ribs compressing, your breathing becoming shallower. The goal was to reduce your natural waist measurement by 4 to 6 inches minimum. Some women aimed for 8 or even 10 inches of reduction. Think about that. Your waist compressed by nearly a third, your internal organs displaced, your ribs bending inward under sustained pressure. The immediate effects were obvious. You couldn't breathe deeply, couldn't bend at the waist, couldn't twist your torso naturally. Every movement was restricted, controlled by the rigid structure encasing you. Eating was difficult. Your stomach couldn't expand normally. Large meals were impossible. You'd feel full after a few bites. Eating too much caused intense pain as your stomach tried to expand against the unyielding corset. This contributed to the starvation aesthetic we discussed earlier. Women in tight corsets literally couldn't eat much. Their clothing prevented it. The fashionable thinness was partially enforced mechanically. The corsets also affected digestion. Food couldn't move through your system normally when your organs were compressed and displaced. Constipation was common. Indigestion, nausea, your digestive system struggling to function in its new restricted environment. Your lungs couldn't fully inflate. Every breath was shallow. You were in a constant state of mild oxygen deprivation. This made you tired easily, made physical exertion difficult or impossible, made your brain function less optimally because it wasn't getting quite enough oxygen. Fainting was common. Women would regularly lose consciousness, especially in warm environments or during physically demanding activities like dancing. This wasn't considered alarming. It was normal, expected, just part of wearing properly fashionable clothing. Smelling salts were carried as a matter of course. When a woman fainted, you'd wave the salts under her nose, revive her, loosen her corset slightly if necessary. Then continue with whatever you were doing. The long-term effects were severe. We've discussed the rib deformation, ribs bending inward permanently, changing the shape of the rib cage even when the corset was removed. But there was more. Your spine would curve abnormally. The constant pressure and restriction altered its natural shape. Lordosis, excessive inward curve of the lower spine, was common in women who wore corsets regularly. Your liver would develop grooves, deep indentations where the corset bones pressed against it, day after day, year after year. These grooves were permanent, found in autopsies of women who'd worn corsets their entire adult lives. The same with other organs, kidneys displaced, intestines compressed into abnormal configurations, your entire internal anatomy rearranged to fit inside the corset's rigid structure. Some women developed organ prolapse. The constant downward pressure from a compressed ribcage pushed organs lower than they should be. Uterine prolapse was particularly common, the uterus gradually descending because there was nowhere else for the displaced organs above it to go. Pregnancy in a corset was its own special hell. Women were expected to continue wearing corsets while pregnant. Special maternity corsets existed that allowed for some expansion in the belly while still maintaining the constricted waist and upright posture. This compressed the developing fetus, restricted blood flow to the uterus, made pregnancy complications more likely. Miscarriages were common, babies born undersized, maternal mortality increased, but women wore the corsets anyway, because appearing pregnant but still fashionable was more important than the health of mother or child, because gaining too much visible weight during pregnancy was considered unattractive, even though you were literally growing a human being inside you. After pregnancy, the corset was laced even tighter, trying to return to pre-pregnancy measurements, forcing your body back into shape. Never mind that your body had just been through trauma. Never mind that it needed time to heal. Fashion demanded immediate return to tight-laced perfection. Some women never fully recovered. Their bodies, damaged by pregnancy and corsets, remained altered, weakened, more prone to illness and complications. Men wore corsets too, though less universally. Military uniforms often included corsets designed to create an upright, broad-shouldered silhouette. These were less extreme than women's corsets, but still constrictive enough to cause problems. Male corsets compressed the waist and forced the shoulders back, created that military bearing that was considered essential for officers and gentlemen, but they also restricted breathing and movement, which seems particularly problematic for people who might need to, fight. The fashion persisted because it was self-reinforcing. Once everyone was wearing corsets, anyone who didn't looked abnormal by comparison. Natural bodies appeared slovenly, undisciplined, improper, so the pressure to conform was enormous. You either wore the corset and suffered, or you refused and became social pariah. There was no middle option. Some women, particularly those involved in physical labour, wore lighter corsets, or none at all, but they paid a social price, were considered lower class, less refined, not proper ladies. The corset became a marker of class and morality. Proper women wore them, improper women didn't. Your willingness to suffer proved your virtue. Your dedication to fashion proved your social status. This is the pinnacle of beauty standards as control mechanism. Your clothing literally restricting your ability to breathe, move, think clearly, making you dependent on others for basic tasks like getting dressed, marking your body permanently with the evidence of your compliance, and it was completely normalized. This was just what clothing was, what women wore. The damage was expected, accepted, not even particularly remarked upon, unless it became severe enough to be life-threatening. Now let's talk about something even more extreme, something that most people didn't survive intact: deliberate scarification. This is where beauty standards cross into body modification, so extreme it's almost impossible to comprehend. In some regions and subcultures within medieval Europe, deliberately scarring your body was considered attractive, proof of status, evidence of your willingness to suffer for aesthetic purposes. This wasn't universal, it was localized, specific to certain areas, certain social groups. But it happened, and it tells us something important about how far beauty standards could push human behavior. Facial scarring was most common among young noblemen, particularly in Germanic regions. Fighting scars were prestigious, proof that you duelled, that you defended your honor, that you were brave and skilled and willing to face death for glory. But what if you hadn't actually been in many duels? What if your face was annoyingly unscarred, making you look like a coward or a pacifist? Solution: create the scars artificially. This was done secretly. You couldn't admit to it, obviously. The whole point was that people thought you'd earned these scars through bravery, but among certain groups of young men, it was an open secret that many dueling scars were self-inflicted or deliberately acquired through arranged fights. The process was simple in concept, agonizing in execution. Using a sharp blade, a knife or razor, make clean cuts on your face, cheeks, forehead, near your eye, anywhere that would be visible and recognizable as a blade wound. The cuts had to be deep enough to scar permanently, but controlled enough not to cause serious damage. You weren't trying to actually injure yourself dangerously. Just create the mark. Then, and this is crucial, you had to prevent the wound from healing cleanly, because if it healed well, the scar would be minimal, barely visible, defeating the purpose. So you'd irritate the wound, keep it open longer than it should be, apply substances that would cause inflammation. Some men used salt, others used various caustic substances. The goal was to create excessive scarring, keloid tissue that would raise and remain visible for life. The pain was intense. These were open wounds on your face, being deliberately prevented from healing. Every expression would reopen them. Eating was agony. Talking hurt. Sleeping was difficult because any pressure on the wounds would wake you. Infection was a serious risk. Face wounds can easily spread infection to your brain. Men died from these self-inflicted scars, from infections that started as vanity projects and ended with fever and delirium and death. But among certain social circles, these scars were admired. They marked you as someone who'd faced danger, who'd fought for your honor, who bore the visible proof of your bravery. That the scars were fake didn't matter to the men who bore them. They felt more masculine, more warrior-like. The scars became part of their identity. For women, scarification was rarer but not unheard of. In some regions, small scars on hands or arms were considered attractive. Proof of needlework skill, you'd pricked yourself so many times that you bore the marks. Evidence of domestic dedication. Some women would deliberately scar themselves to create this appearance, small cuts or burns on their fingers and hands, making themselves look like they'd spent years doing fine needlework, whether they actually had or not. Other women use scarification for contraceptive purposes. This is darker, more medical, less about beauty but still relevant. In an era with no reliable birth control, some women would deliberately scar their uterus after having as many children as they wanted or could survive. This was done by midwives or women with medical knowledge, using instruments inserted into the uterus to create scarring that would prevent future pregnancies. The procedure was dangerous, often caused severe infections, sometimes killed the woman. But for some, the risk was worth it to avoid dying in childbirth from yet another pregnancy. This is technically medical rather than cosmetic, but it shows the lengths women would go to control their own bodies in an era that gave them almost no control. Back to aesthetic scarification. In some Mediterranean regions, small decorative scars were fashionable, usually on shoulders or upper arms, places that could be covered or revealed depending on the occasion. These scars were created using hot needles or small branding instruments, patterns burned into skin, floral designs, geometric shapes, your skin as canvas. The process was hideously painful. Burning flesh has a smell, sweet and sickening. The wounds would weep for days, scab over. The scabs would crack and bleed again, eventually heal into raised scar tissue that held the shape of the original burn. These decorative scars were usually hidden, revealed only in intimate settings, a secret mark that proved you'd undergone the ritual, that you'd survived the pain, that you bore permanent proof of your commitment to beauty. Why would anyone do this? Why would you voluntarily burn patterns into your own skin? Status, belonging, proof of pain endured, in cultures where suffering was valorized, where the ability to withstand agony was admired. These scars were achievements, marks of honor, and once some people in a social group had them, everyone else felt pressure to get them too, to prove they were equally brave, equally committed, equally willing to modify their bodies for social acceptance. This is the dark heart of beauty standards. They're not about being attractive, they're about conformity, about proving through your modified body that you belong to the group, that you'll follow the rules even when the rules require mutilation. The scars couldn't be removed. This wasn't temporary like makeup. Once you burned a pattern into your skin, it was there forever. A permanent mark of a decision you made in youth, possibly under social pressure, that you'd carry for life. Some people regretted it, wished they hadn't done it, but there was no undo. The scars stayed. Faded slightly with age, but never disappeared. You bore the mark of your conformity forever. Scarification as beauty practice declined as European culture became more unified and fashion became more centralized. But in isolated pockets, in specific subcultures, it persisted longer. Proof that human beings will do absolutely anything to their bodies if their social group defines it as desirable. We've covered a lot of ground, a lot of suffering, a lot of self-inflicted harm in pursuit of arbitrary beauty standards. But now we need to address the elephant in the room, the massive, obvious contradiction that runs through all of this. Here's the question that probably occurred to you several times during this journey. Did men actually find any of this attractive? The answer is complicated, frustrating, and reveals something fundamental about beauty standards that's still true today. Men claimed to want these things, wrote poetry about pale skin and high foreheads, praised women who fit the fashionable ideal, married the women who had achieved the look. But in private, in actual expressions of desire, men often preferred something completely different. Love letters from the period, when they get personal and intimate, describe features that don't match the fashion. Men praise women's natural hair, visible beneath the towers and constructions. They comment on full natural eyebrows. They express desire for women who aren't wearing the white lead makeup that was supposedly essential. Medical texts offer advice on how to achieve conception, and they consistently note that thin women have more difficulty getting pregnant. That starvation affects fertility. That extremely tight corseting can prevent conception. And yet, these were the beauty standards. So who was driving this? Who decided that these particular features were beautiful? Women. Primarily women, in competition with other women. This is the uncomfortable truth. Most extreme beauty standards aren't actually about attracting men. They're about outcompeting other women, about proving your status relative to your female peers. Men might appreciate beauty in a general sense, but they weren't demanding high foreheads or hair towers or lead-poisoned faces. That pressure came from women themselves, from mothers training daughters, from peers competing for social status, from entire systems of feminine one-upmanship that men barely participated in. The male role was mostly passive. They benefited from the system without having to enforce it. They married the women who'd successfully navigated the beauty standards. They enjoyed the fruits of female competition. But they didn't create or maintain the standards themselves. This is true across cultures and time periods. Women's fashion, especially the most extreme, most painful versions, is primarily driven by intersexual competition. Women judging women, women competing with women. Men are almost incidental to the process. Think about it. Men didn't care if your forehead was 3 inches higher. They probably couldn't even articulate why one forehead was better than another. But women could. Women measured, women compared, women judged. Men didn't design the corsets, didn't demand specific waist measurements, didn't participate in the calculations about how many inches of reduction was proper. Women did that to each other, and to themselves. This isn't to absolve men of responsibility. Male-dominated social structures created the conditions where women's primary value was their appearance and marriageability, where economic security depended on attracting a husband, where women competed because the alternative was poverty or spinsterhood. Men built the cage, women decorated it, and then fought each other within it. The same pattern plays out with every beauty standard we've discussed. The starvation aesthetic, men generally preferred women who looked healthy enough to bear children. But women competed over who could appear most spiritually refined through their thinness. The toxic cosmetics. Men couldn't tell the difference between lead-based face paint and plant-based alternatives, but women could. And they judged each other for using inferior products. The elaborate hairstyles, men found them impressive but didn't particularly care about the specifics. Women, however, could identify exactly which fashion was 2 years out of date, which construction was poorly executed, whose hair tower was inferior. This explains why these standards persisted despite being physically harmful, because harm wasn't a bug, it was a feature. The difficulty of achieving the standard proved your dedication, your status, your superiority over women who couldn't or wouldn't go as far. If any woman could easily achieve the beauty standard, it wouldn't be valuable. The value came from the suffering, from the expense, from the exclusivity. Only women wealthy enough to afford the cosmetics could use them. Only women with servants could maintain the elaborate hairstyles. Only women who didn't need to do physical labor could wear the restrictive clothing. Beauty standards were class markers enforced by women, used to distinguish themselves from women in lower social positions. And once you'd invested in achieving the standard, spent money, endured pain, modified your body permanently, you had incentive to maintain it, to judge other women who hadn't done the same, to pass the standard on to your daughters. This creates a self-perpetuating system. Each generation of women teaches the next that these standards are essential, that beauty requires suffering, that your value depends on your appearance, that you must compete with other women for male attention and social status. And men? Men just benefited from having multiple women competing for their favor. They didn't have to enforce the standards actively. The women enforced them on each other. This is why beauty standards are so persistent, why they're so hard to change. Because they're not really about what men find attractive. They're about feminine social hierarchies, about women proving their superiority to other women. The male gaze is real, but it's not the primary driver. It's the justification, the excuse, the stated reason that covers the actual mechanism of female competition. Women torture themselves to impress other women, to prove they're more dedicated, more refined, more deserving of status. Men are just the prize that justifies the competition. This is deeply uncomfortable to acknowledge, because it means women are complicit in their own oppression, that women enforce these standards on each other, often more harshly than men ever did. But understanding this is essential, because it explains why simply changing men's preferences doesn't fix the problem. Why telling women that men prefer natural beauty doesn't stop them from pursuing extreme modifications. Because it was never really about men's preferences. It was about winning a competition that women were forced into by economic and social structures, and then perpetuated among themselves. The solution isn't to convince men to like different things. It's to dismantle the structures that make women's appearance their primary source of value. To create alternatives to marriage as economic security. To stop teaching girls that their worth depends on being prettier than other girls. But that's a modern conversation. In the medieval period, these structures were absolute. Women had no alternative. Beauty standards were survival strategies in a world that gave women almost no other way to secure their futures. So they plucked and starved and poisoned and modified, competed and judged and suffered, created elaborate hierarchies of feminine beauty that men barely understood but thoroughly benefited from. And the cycle continued, generation after generation, each one teaching the next that this is just how things are, that beauty requires sacrifice, that your body is never good enough as nature made it. Which brings us to our conclusion. After examining all these brutal, bizarre, genuinely insane beauty practices, what can we actually say about medieval beauty standards? We've spent over an hour cataloguing suffering, self-inflicted harm, poisoning and starvation and mutilation, all in the name of beauty, all considered normal, accepted, required. And the question that haunts all of this, why? Why would humans do this to themselves? What drives people to destroy their own bodies in pursuit of arbitrary aesthetic standards? The answer is both the simple and terrifying. Belonging. Humans are social animals. We need to belong to groups to survive. Historically, being cast out of your social group meant death, literally. You couldn't survive alone. You needed the protection, the resources, the cooperation of others. And every social group has markers of belonging, ways of signalling that you're one of us, that you follow the rules, that you deserve to remain in the group. In medieval Europe, for women especially, appearance was one of the most important belonging markers. Your body announced your social position, your wealth, your commitment to feminine virtues, your suitability for marriage. Fail to meet the beauty standards? You risk being cast out. being unable to marry, being considered worthless. In a world where women's economic security depended almost entirely on marriage, this wasn't just social rejection. It was potential death sentence. So women modified their bodies, suffered, poisoned themselves, because the alternative, social death, was worse than physical suffering. This explains why rational people did irrational things, why they continued practices that were obviously harmful, because the harm was individual and future. The benefit was social and immediate. Yes, this might kill you in 20 years, but it helps you survive today. That's a trade most people will make, especially when everyone around you is making the same trade. The psychological toll of this was immense. Imagine living in a body that you hate, that you're constantly modifying, that never meets the standard no matter how much you suffer. Because beauty standards have a cruel feature. They're always just out of reach. No matter how much you do, there's always more you could do. Your forehead could be higher. Your waist could be smaller. Your skin could be paler. Perfection is impossible. The standard shifts. What was beautiful yesterday is common today. To maintain your status, you need to do more. Go further. Suffer more. This creates a treadmill of suffering. You can never step off, never rest, never declare yourself beautiful enough and stop. The anxiety this generates is crushing. Constant vigilance, constant self-monitoring, constant comparison to other women, constant fear that you're falling behind, and the shame. Deep, internalized shame about your natural body. The body you were born with is wrong, ugly, unacceptable. It needs to be hidden, modified, corrected. This shame starts in childhood. Girls watch their mothers undergo these practices, learn that this is just what women do, internalize the message that their bodies are projects to be managed rather than bodies to be inhabited. By the time they're adults, the modification is automatic, not even questioned, just part of life, of being a woman, of being acceptable. The psychological damage compounds across generations, each generation teaching the next, each woman passing on her shame and her coping mechanisms. The trauma becomes cultural, normalized, invisible. And men? Men generally don't understand any of this. They benefit from it. They get to choose from women who've modified themselves to be maximally attractive. But they don't grasp the psychological cost. They don't see the hours of pain, the constant anxiety, the deep shame. They just see the finished product, the beautiful woman, and they assume she's naturally that way. This disconnect is itself damaging. Because women's suffering is invisible. Their efforts are unseen. They're judged on the results without any understanding of the process. And if a woman complains, if she says this is too hard, too painful, too much, she's considered vain, shallow, weak, unable to handle the basic requirements of femininity. There's no sympathy, no understanding that these aren't natural requirements, but socially constructed tortures. Because everyone does it, it's not seen as torture. It's just life. This is gaslighting on a cultural scale. Women are told their suffering is normal, that they're weak for struggling with it, that they should be grateful for the opportunity to make themselves beautiful. The psychological resilience required to survive this is remarkable. Medieval women weren't weak, they were incredibly strong. They endured daily torture while performing all the other roles society demanded of them. Bearing children, running households, managing servants, navigating politics, all while slowly poisoning themselves with lead. While starving, while wearing corsets that prevented breathing, while modifying their bodies in ways that caused permanent damage. And they couldn't complain, couldn't admit struggle, had to perform beauty as if it were effortless, as if the white skin and elaborate hair and perfect proportions came naturally. Because the moment you admitted the work, the illusion shattered. Beauty was supposed to be inherent, natural, a gift from God. Revealing that it was constructed through suffering diminished its value. So women suffered in silence, kept the secrets, maintained the illusion, passed the practices onto their daughters with the same silence. Generation after generation, century after century, the suffering compounding, the standards escalating, each generation going slightly further than the last. This is the true horror of beauty standards. Not the individual practices, though those were brutal enough, but the psychological mechanism that perpetuates them. The way they infiltrate your sense of self, make you complicit in your own oppression, turn you into an enforcer of standards that harm you. Medieval women weren't stupid. They weren't ignorant of the harm. They knew the lead was poison, knew the corsets damaged organs, knew the starvation made them ill. They did it anyway, because the psychological architecture of their world left them no choice, because humans will endure remarkable suffering to belong, to be valued, to avoid social death. We like to think we're better now, that modern beauty standards are less harmful, less extreme, more rational. But are they? Are we? We still modify our bodies in pursuit of arbitrary standards, still use products that harm us, still develop eating disorders, trying to achieve impossible proportions, still endure painful procedures for aesthetic purposes. The specific practices change, the underlying mechanism doesn't. We're still social animals, still desperate to belong, still willing to suffer for acceptance. Medieval women plucked their hairlines, and we get botulinum toxin injected into our faces. They wore corsets, and we get cosmetic surgery. They starved themselves for holiness, and we starve ourselves for health. Different vocabulary, same compulsion. The lesson isn't that medieval people were barbaric and were enlightened. The lesson is that beauty standards, all beauty standards, are mechanisms of control. They keep us distracted, keep us competing with each other, keep us focused on our bodies rather than on changing the structures that limit us. As long as women are obsessed with achieving beauty standards, they're not organizing politically, not demanding economic equality, not threatening male power structures. Beauty standards are a remarkably effective control mechanism. They're self-enforcing. They create hierarchies among women that divide us. They make us complicit in our own oppression, and they do it by hijacking our fundamental need to belong, by making belonging contingent on suffering, by making our bodies the battleground for social acceptance. Medieval women understood this, maybe not consciously, maybe not in those terms, but they understood that their bodies weren't their own, that beauty was survival, that refusing to participate meant social death, and they participated because humans are survivors. We do what we need to do to stay alive, to stay in the group, to secure our futures and our children's futures. The real tragedy isn't the specific practices, it's that we built a world where these practices were necessary, where women had to destroy their bodies to have value, where suffering was the price of belonging. We can look back at medieval beauty standards and feel horrified, feel superior, feel grateful we don't live in that world anymore. But we should also look closer at our own practices, our own standards, our own willingness to suffer for beauty. Because the distance between their world and ours is smaller than we'd like to admit. The faces change, the fashions evolve, but the underlying mechanism, trade your body for belonging, endure pain for acceptance, prove your worth through modification, that remains. Medieval women plucked their foreheads bald. We laser our entire bodies hairless. They wore corsets. We get waist trainers and shapewear. They use lead face paint. We use cosmetics with questionable ingredients. They damage their bodies pursuing impossible standards. We damage our bodies pursuing impossible standards. They couldn't escape. Their culture's expectations. Can we escape ours? That's the question left hanging. The one we should all be asking. Not just about beauty, but about all the ways we modify ourselves for social acceptance. All the ways we trade our authentic selves for belonging. Medieval women didn't have a choice. They were trapped by economic reality and social structures that left them no alternatives. We have more choices, more freedom, more options, which makes our compliance with beauty standards even more interesting, even more revealing. Because if we're still doing it despite having alternatives, what does that say about the psychological power of these standards? It says they work. They hijack our brains, make us police ourselves, make us willing participants in our own modification. That's the genius and the horror of beauty standards. They don't need enforcement from outside because we enforce them on ourselves. We internalize the standards, make them part of our identity, judge ourselves more harshly than anyone else could. Medieval women taught us this through their suffering, through their compliance, through their participation in a system that harmed them. They show us what humans will endure for belonging, how far we'll go, how much we'll sacrifice, how completely we'll modify ourselves. And they remind us that beauty standards aren't natural, aren't inevitable, aren't about what's actually attractive. They're about power, control, creating hierarchies and maintaining structures that benefit those at the top. The specific standards change, the power structure remains. So the next time you look in a mirror and see flaws, the next time you consider a beauty practice or product or procedure, remember the medieval women who plucked themselves bald, who starved themselves holy, who poisoned themselves beautiful. Remember what they endured, remember what it cost them. Remember that beauty standards have always demanded suffering, have always been about control more than aesthetics. And ask yourself, is belonging worth this price? Is acceptance worth modifying your body? Is beauty worth suffering? For medieval women, the answer was yes, because they had no choice. We have choices, more than they ever dreamed of. We can refuse, can resist, can reject standards that harm us. But will we? That's the question. That's the challenge. That's what medieval beauty standards teach us about ourselves. We're capable of remarkable suffering for social acceptance, capable of modifying ourselves beyond recognition, capable of passing harmful practices from generation to generation because that's just what's done. But we're also capable of change, of resistance, of building different systems that don't require suffering for belonging. Medieval women couldn't do that. They were trapped, but they survived anyway, endured anyway, passed something down to us anyway. Not just the story of their suffering, but the proof of human resilience, the demonstration of what we can survive, the reminder that we're stronger than the systems that try to control us. That's what I want you to take from this. Not just horror at the practices, not just superiority that we don't do exactly those things anymore, but understanding, recognition, and maybe, hopefully, the beginning of resistance. Because we're still doing this, just with different tools, different vocabulary, different specific practices, but the same underlying compulsion, the same sacrifice of body for belonging. And if we can recognize that, if we can see the connection between medieval women plucking their foreheads and modern people pursuing beauty standards, maybe we can break the cycle. Maybe we can build something different. Maybe we can create a world where belonging doesn't require suffering, where bodies can exist unmodified, where beauty isn't currency and suffering isn't the price of acceptance. Medieval women couldn't build that world, but they can teach us why we need to, through their suffering, through their compliance, through their quiet resistance and remarkable endurance. They survived, despite everything. Despite the poison and the starvation and the mutilation, they survived, and they want us to do better. Be better, build better. That's the real lesson. Not the specific practices, not the historical details, but the reminder that beauty standards have always been about control, and that we have the power to refuse them. If we're brave enough, if we're willing enough, if we can resist the psychological pull of belonging badly enough to choose authenticity instead. That's the challenge. That's what medieval beauty standards leave us with. Not just knowledge of the past, but a question about the future. What will we choose? Belonging through suffering, or something new, something better, something that doesn't require destroying ourselves to be acceptable? Medieval women are watching, waiting to see what we do with the freedom they never had, the choices they couldn't make, the alternatives they couldn't even imagine. Let's not waste it. Let's build something worthy of their suffering, something that honors their endurance by finally breaking the cycle. That's how we repay them, not with pity, but with revolution, with refusal, with resistance to every beauty standard that demands we trade our bodies for belonging. They plucked and starved and poisoned. They suffered and endured and survived. They passed the torch. Now we carry it. What we do with it? That's on us. That's our choice. That's our responsibility. To the medieval women who came before, and to the women who come after. Let's choose better. Let's build better. Let's finally break free. Thanks for staying with me through this journey into medieval suffering. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person I make these for. Someone willing to look at the uncomfortable parts of history. Someone who understands that the past has lessons for the present. Drop a comment. Let me know which practice horrified you most, which one you hadn't heard about before, where you're watching from, what time it is there. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives into history's darkest corners. More stories about how humans have always been willing to destroy themselves for social acceptance. More reminders that we're not as different from our ancestors as we'd like to believe. Until next time, sleep well, or try to, because now you know what people used to do to be beautiful. Now you've seen how far humans will go for belonging, and maybe, hopefully, you'll think twice before pursuing your own beauty standards. Before modifying yourself for acceptance, before trading your body for belonging. Medieval women didn't have a choice. You do. Use it wisely. Good night.